They built a $90 million floating paradise on land they didn't know I owned. They built a $1 million floating paradise on waters I quietly owned. 3 days before the bulldozers rolled in, the HOA tried to throw me off their bay, but they had no idea every glass pod and steel piling sat on a truth I'd held for years. And the moment I opened that document, the entire bay began to fall apart. The first thing I remember is the sound. Not the yelling, not the crying. That came later. It was the grinding roar of steel tracks on steel decking, echoing across the water like distant thunder. 3 yellow bulldozers rolled in formation across the floating platforms, blades lowered, chewing through stone that had cost more than most of my neighbors made in a year. From where I stood on the high balcony of the central hall, the whole private bay spread out beneath us. Glass pod villas sat in circles on the water. Boats bobbed at their moorings. The bay, usually calm and blue, was streaked now with dust, broken tile, and glittering sprays of glass. Behind me, 200 people pressed forward, scraping chairs, grabbing railings, fighting for a better view of the disaster they never saw coming. In front of me, framed by chrome rails and glass windbreakers, the machines kept moving. "Stop them!" a woman screamed. "Somebody stop them!" Somebody tried. HOA. President Bethany Reed shoved past me so hard my shoulder hit the railing. She didn't look at me. In a hot pink suit that glared against the steel and glass, she marched to the microphone stand and seized it. "This is a mistake!" she shrieked, voice blasting out over the bay. "All work stops now. This is an active residential community. You don't have authority here. I do." Her words bounced off the domes and the water. The bulldozer operators didn't pause. One lowered his blade, and a row of planters exploded into dust and flying greenery. The crowd roared. Some yelled at the workers. Some yelled at Bethany. A few just yelled at the sky, unable to accept that the paradise they'd paid millions for was being chewed apart in front of them. I didn't yell. I tightened my grip on the folder in my hands until the worn edges of the deed cut into my palm. The paper was old, thick, warped at the corners from years in a box. My father's signature sat there in careful ink, above the printed words. Submerged land rights. Coal Bay. Coal Bay. My bay. My ocean floor under all of this chrome and glass. A gust of wind came in from the mouth of the bay, carrying the tang of salt and diesel. The glass barrier rattled. Below, a crane's siren whooped before its cable tightened around a glass dome. The structure lifted off its supports with a long groan, metal protesting as the bolts sheared. Bethany's voice cracked as she leaned over the microphone. "You can't do this," she cried. "We have permits. This is Nautilus Point, a private HOA community. I'll have every one of you arrested." Down on the water, the lead site supervisor barely glanced up. Hard hat, orange vest, clipboard. Beside him, a woman in a navy blazer held a tablet and a stack of forms stamped with the state seal. They weren't here for a mistake. They were here to correct one. "Remy!" Bethany spun toward me, eyes wild, mascara beginning to smear. Tell them this is your community. Tell them you signed off on all this work. This is your chance to fix whatever you did." The crowd turned too, a ripple of faces, angry, scared, hopeful, shifting in my direction. For 5 years, most of them had barely acknowledged I existed. Now, suddenly, I was the one they looked to. I looked past them, over the balcony rail, to where the bulldozers were reaching the first ring of glass pods. The closest villa had a rooftop deck with a hot tub. I remembered the day the family moved in. Champagne on the dock. Bethany giving a speech about elevated coastal living while I watched from my pickup on the cliff road. The bulldozer blade hit the edge of the deck. Glass shattered. The hot tub tipped and went over the side, disappearing into the water with a heavy splash. The sound cut through the shouting like a bell. Behind me, someone started crying. Another person swore they would sue, that they would go to the news, that this couldn't be legal. But the diesel engines kept idling, the steel tracks kept clanking across the platforms, and the whole floating city groaned under the weight of consequences coming due. "Remy!" Bethany's voice dropped, desperate now. "Say something!" "I already did," I said quietly. She stared, not understanding. Then she saw the folder in my hands, the scuffed manila edges, the legal seal, the old ink. Her gaze snapped back up to my face, and for just a second, the Queen of the Bay act slipped. Fear broke through the paint. What did you do?" she whispered. I stepped closer to the microphone. I didn't take it from her. I didn't have to. "I told them the truth," I said, "that you built a kingdom on land you never owned, that every dock, every villa, every glass pod out there is sitting on top of my property, and that today the state is enforcing a court order that's been signed for weeks." A murmur went through the crowd. Somebody shouted that I was lying. Someone else demanded to see documents. In the corner of my eye, Sheriff Dunn shifted his weight, one hand near his belt, the other holding a folded copy of the judgment. Bethany swallowed hard. "You're just a rancher," she spat, voice shaking. "You own some scrubland and a shack on the cliff. You don't own this bay. We bought this water. We improved it. You bought air," I cut in. "Pretty expensive air. The ground underneath still belongs to me." The words hung there, heavier than any steel beam. Somewhere deep in the structure below us, a generator kicked on, humming through the metal bones of the platforms. The whole place seemed to vibrate, like it knew its time was up. For a moment, nothing moved. Then another bulldozer blade dropped. This time it took out an entire walkway between pods. The floating rings shifted. People on the outer balconies stumbled, grabbing railings as their views sagged a few inches closer to the water. "Illegal occupancy," the woman in the navy blazer called, through a loudhailer from the barge. "All non-essential personnel must clear the platforms immediately. This site is under state and court-ordered removal." Her words bounced off glass and steel and landed on the balcony where we stood. A few residents started toward the doors, clutching bags and phones. Others stayed rooted in place, stuck between denial and anger. Bethany didn't move at all. "You can't do this to me," she said, smaller now. "I built this place. I made this bay worth something. Without me, it was nothing but a muddy cove no one cared about." I thought of the bay before the construction barges came. Quiet mornings with fog hanging over the water, pelicans skimming the surface, my wife laughing as she tried to teach me how to skip rocks. The old wooden dock my father built with his own hands, long before anyone thought to rename the place. "You're wrong about that," I said. Glass exploded as another dome gave way. The sun caught the falling shards, turning them into brief flashes before they vanished into the churning water. Dust rose in pale clouds drifting across the bay. Somewhere behind us, a resident finally asked the question everyone else was thinking. "How is this even possible?" he shouted. "How can he own the bay? How can they tear all this down?" I didn't answer him. Not yet. Because the truth was, this didn't start with bulldozers or barges or court orders. It didn't start with Bethany's speeches or her pink suits or the first glass pod they dropped onto my water. It started with an old aluminum boat at sunrise, a set of coordinates in my father's handwriting, and a question no one in the HOA ever bothered to ask. 3 days earlier, none of them knew this place wasn't theirs. The morning the trouble finally surfaced, the bay was as calm as a sheet of brushed steel. Dawn hadn't fully broken yet. The sky held that soft lavender glow that lasts only a few minutes before the sun makes its entrance. Mist floated low over the water, sliding between the floating walkways and the curved glass villas like breath from some sleeping giant. My aluminum skiff, the same one my father used when he mapped these waters, creaked under my weight as I pushed off from the small wooden ramp I kept hidden beneath the cliff. The hull scraped rocks, then drifted loose, rocking gently as the tide drew it out. I sat in the stern, hands steady on the worn wooden oars, rowing toward the first coordinate in my notebook. The air smelled like salt and wet metal. The only sound was the faint clink of the oarlocks and the murmur of the water licking the sides of the boat. If anyone from the HOA had been awake enough to look out their villa windows, they would have seen nothing more than a rancher in a beat-up skiff. Just Remy Cole, scruffy, quiet, always keeping to himself on that ridge that overlooked the bay. A man they'd fined 3 times for unsightly equipment storage. A man they'd warned about trespassing when he tied his own boat to his own dock. A man they assumed didn't know a thing worth knowing. That suited me just fine. I lifted the small sonar unit from the floorboards and dipped the transducer into the water. The little screen lit up with depth readings, contour lines, and bottom density data. Familiar numbers. Familiar shapes. The same ones I had memorized as a kid, sitting behind my father in this same boat. The HOA never asked who charted this bay before their developers ever touched it. They didn't ask who owned the seabed. They never think to ask questions that don't benefit them. Behind me, across the misty water, the floating community began to reveal itself as the light strengthened, a halo of glass pods, shining faintly in the dawn like a ring of lanterns. Beyond that, on the highest balcony, I spotted the silhouette of a person, probably one of the early risers who liked to photograph the sunrise, unaware of the legal storm underneath their feet. I adjusted the boat toward the second coordinate. That's when I heard the engines. 2 HOA security boats rounded the far dock, cutting through the water with practiced authority. Their blue and white hulls bore the Nautilus Point emblem, a spiral shell, and each was driven by a uniformed guard who looked like he took the job a little too seriously. I kept my head down and logged another reading. The hum of their engines grew louder. When they reached me, both slowed to idle, forming a half circle around my skiff. One guard stepped to the rail. "Sir," he called, already using the tone of someone about to issue a citation. "You're within HOA-controlled waters. You need to turn around immediately." I looked up at them, blinking against the brightening sky. HOA-controlled waters? I repeated, as if I'd never heard the phrase before. That's an interesting one. It isn't a suggestion, the guard said, jaw tight. This bay is private property. Only residents and authorized personnel are allowed within the inner perimeter. I let the words hang for a moment. Mist drifted between us. A gull cried over our heads. Then I asked the question I'd been waiting years to ask. Can you tell me the legal basis for that claim? Both guards exchanged a blink, one of those quick, sideways glances people give when something doesn't fit. The first guard cleared his throat. Sir, it's in the HOA bylaws. Bylaws for homes built on floating platforms, I said, dipping the sonar back into the water, are not the same thing as a deed for the land, or seabed, underneath them. For a second, nobody spoke. Then the younger guard frowned. Meaning what, exactly? I nodded at the water beneath my boat. Meaning you boys might want to check whose bottom you're standing on. They stiffened at the phrasing. On land, that line would have sounded rude. But on the water, on my water, it was simply the truth. The senior guard reached for his radio. Hold tight, he muttered, not to me, but to himself. Mrs. Reed needs to hear about this. I continued my measurements. Calm, steady, exact. A moment later, the guard spoke into his radio, voice low. President Reed, we have a situation in the east sector. The rancher's back, And he's asking questions. Static crackled. Then Bethany's voice arrived, sharp as broken glass. "Stall him. I'll be right there." I could have laughed. Of course she'd come herself. Bethany Reed never missed the chance to perform authority. One of the guards attempted small talk. "You causing trouble again, Mr. Cole?" "No," I said. "Just checking on something my father left me." "And what's that?" "Coordinates," I said. "And rights." The guards didn't understand. They weren't supposed to. That part would come later. A sleek white yacht emerged from behind the marina, slicing the water like a scalpel. Even from a distance, the woman standing on its bow stood out, bright, hot pink suit glowing like a flare against the muted morning. Bethany Reed, the queen of glass and bylaws. She lifted her sunglasses as she neared, looking down at me like I was a stain on her perfect view. "Mr. Cole," she called, voice dripping with command. "You are once again trespassing." I held up my notebook. Funny. My notes say I'm right where I belong. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't the day the bay broke. It was the day Bethany Reed realized something she had never once considered. The quiet rancher on the cliff wasn't drifting through life. He was watching, measuring, waiting. And he knew this bay, above and below the surface, better than anyone alive. By mid-morning, the mist had burned off, leaving the water a flat sheet of polished blue stretching all the way to the mouth of the cove. I steered the aluminum skiff back toward the cliffside, letting the breeze push me the last few yards until the hull scraped gently against the familiar rocks. Above me, the ridge rose steeply, dry grass, scattered cedar trees, and the old fence line that marked the upper boundary of my ranch. Folks who moved into the bay villas thought the ridge was nothing more than undeveloped land. They used that phrase a lot. Undeveloped, untapped, wasted. They thought it was empty because they didn't understand it. I climbed the narrow path cut into the hillside decades ago, boots sinking into damp earth where the morning dew lingered. By the time I reached the top, the sun had warmed the wooden gate enough that when I pushed it open, the hinges gave a soft, familiar groan. Dust kicked up beneath my steps as I crossed the yard. The ranch house stood solid and quiet. 2 stories of weathered pine, a metal roof that creaked when the wind shifted, and a porch where my wife used to sit in the evenings with a quilt over her lap. Even now, 3 years after losing her, I still caught myself glancing at the rocking chair beside the front door, half expecting to see her there. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and brewed coffee. I set my notebook on the kitchen table and poured myself a cup, letting the warmth settle into my hands. Outside the window, the bay shimmered, an entire world built on top of mine piece by piece without ever asking who it belonged to. Back when my wife was still alive, we watched the first barge pull in. It carried the foundation slabs for the villas, the kind that could be anchored to the bay floor with long steel pilings. She'd rested her head on my shoulder that evening, her voice soft as the sun set behind the ridge. "Do they even have permits for this?" she had asked. I'd told her the truth. "I don't know, but I know whose name is on that seabed." Not long after she passed, Bethany Reed arrived like a force of nature. Pink suit, designer heels, and a smile sharp enough to cut through glass. She shook my hand the way someone does when they're already planning to shove you aside. "We're bringing culture to the cove," she'd said, gesturing to the floating models on her tablet. "A new standard of coastal living." I'd nodded politely. She'd mistaken my silence for approval. The fines started weeks later. A notice taped to my gate. Unregistered vessel stored within HOA visual boundary. Another on my dock. Unauthorized structure extending into community aesthetic zone. And the worst one. Left folded under my windshield wiper at the general store. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Legal action. Against me. On my own land. I didn't pay the fines. I didn't argue either. I saved every paper, every photo, every date. Watched the HOA move in like it owned the place. I watched Bethany give speeches from the balcony she liked to call her overlook. I watched families move into villas worth millions, while my modest ranch became, in their eyes, a blemish spoiling their view. "Man like you should sell and move inland," one resident had suggested as he passed me on the dock. "This bay's for a different kind of lifestyle." I'd thought about my father then, how he carved our initials into the wooden post of the old dock, how he taught me the lay of every slope under that water, and how he warned me long before the first HOA president ever dreamt of this place that someday someone would try to take what wasn't theirs. I didn't sell, but I did learn. I learned their schedules, learned the weak points in their bylaws, learned that their construction timeline was far too fast for legal review. I learned who Bethany trusted, who she didn't, and which of her board members seemed uneasy at every meeting. Most importantly, I learned to keep quiet. People underestimate a man who keeps quiet. They think silence means surrender. They think a slow nod means agreement. They think a rancher with dust on his boots and grief in his eyes won't lift his head long enough to see what they're taking from him. But the truth is, silence gives you room to listen. And grief gives you something dangerous: patience. By mid-afternoon, I'd finished my coffee and stepped onto the porch. The wind had picked up, carrying the faint hum of construction machinery from the bay. Sunlight caught the glass pods, scattering bright reflections that danced across the water. A beautiful sight, if you didn't know the truth under it. I walked down toward the old storage shed, where the tools hung in neat rows, and my father's surveying gear sat untouched for years. Dust lay thick on the case. When I opened it, the hinges protested softly, as though surprised to see daylight again. The theodolite inside wasn't modern, but it was precise. My father had taught me how to use it before I could drive. I lifted it carefully, feeling the weight settle into my palms. This equipment didn't just measure distance and angle. It measured history. His history, my history, the land and water we'd tended long before any of these newcomers imagined luxury floating villas on a quiet bay. As I secured the tripod under my arm, a pickup rumbled up the dirt road. Sheriff Dunn stepped out, tipping his hat in greeting. His eyes scanned the surveying gear, then drifted to the bay. "Heard you were out there this morning," he said. "Bethany's already stirring up noise." "I figured she would," I answered. "She doesn't like questions." "She likes control," he corrected. "Questions get in the way of that." He hesitated before speaking again. "You treading close to something big, Remy?" I tightened the strap around the tripod. "I'm treading exactly where I'm allowed to." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Just make sure you know what you're walking into. Folks down there, they think they own the world." I looked out at the glittering bay, at the floating empire rising from water that wasn't theirs. "They don't," I said quietly. He nodded again, slower this time. "Just be careful." When his truck disappeared over the ridge, the silence returned, a wide, steady silence that settled over the ranch like dust. I walked back toward the cliff, carrying my father's tools and the truth no one else seemed to know. Below, the glass pods caught the late sunlight and flashed like coins. Pretty things, fragile things, things built on nothing solid. And the people living there, the ones who pushed me off my own dock and called me a trespasser, they had no idea that every step they took rested on ground they never owned, and that one day soon, their entire world would feel the weight of that truth. By the time I reached the cliff's edge again, the floating community was alive with movement. Afternoon sunlight bounced across hundreds of glass panels, throwing shards of white light into the air. Speedboats circled the perimeter in slow patrol loops. Construction barges hummed as cranes lifted beams from one platform to another. From up here, the entire place looked like some futuristic jewel, polished, expensive, precise. But if you knew how to look, you could see the flaws. You could see that the inner ring of pods sat lower in the water than the outer ring. You could see that the walkway between sections 2 and 3 had a noticeable bow after last winter's storm. You could see, if you were trained to see, that the anchoring lines were pulling too tight, strained beyond what the soil beneath them could handle. Jake Mercer could see it too. Jake had once been the lead engineer on Bethany Reed's dream project, before she decided that engineers asking about permits were slowing progress, before she shifted her loyalty to whoever promised faster timelines and bigger investors, before she replaced skill with obedience. I spotted him from the ridge as he stepped off a workboat, clipboard under his arm, hard hat askew like he'd been running a dozen tasks at once. He paused on the dock, staring at one of the floating walkways, then knelt to inspect a seam. Even from this distance, I could tell the sight bothered him. The man was too honest to hide concern well. Down in the heart of the development, the central balcony where Bethany held her meetings was already filling with board members. Their bright clothes and polished shoes looked almost comical against the industrial railing. A large digital display flickered to life behind them, projecting the HOA's emblem and the title she liked to give herself: President, Nautilus Point Community Council. Bethany stepped into view moments later, bathed in a sunset glow that she probably thought belonged to her. That suit again, hot pink, sharp-shouldered, tailored like armor. Her hair, curled just so, didn't move even as the ocean wind tugged at everyone else's clothes. She raised her arms, commanding attention. The microphone clipped to her lapel caught the rustle of fabric and the sound of her voice as it boomed out across the bay. "Good afternoon, residents," she declared, tone crisp and controlled. "We are entering the final phase of development. Nautilus Point is becoming the premier floating community on the entire coastline, and our investors are thrilled." Cheers sprinkled through the crowd. But further back, in the shade near the railings, Jake didn't clap. He stood still, eyes locked on one of the digital diagrams flashing across the screen. Something about his posture was off, tense, reluctant, like a man hearing someone brag about walking on a bridge he personally knew was missing bolts. Bethany's voice rose again. "With continued cooperation from our homeowners and generous contributions to the Emergency Development Fund, we will finalize our expansion of the East Marina within just weeks." The Emergency Development Fund. That was her favorite trick, turning every oversight, every missing inspection, every rushed deadline into an emergency residents needed to finance. Folks with money often assumed they could throw more of it at a problem and make it disappear. Most of the time, they'd been right, until now. I watched Bethany switch slides, showing a glittering model of the bay. She traced circles in the air with her manicured hand. "This," she said proudly, "is what coastal living was meant to be." "It's illegal," I murmured to myself. Down on the floating deck, Jake finally moved. He strode toward the side stairs, descending to the lower platform. His steps were clipped, purposeful. He kept glancing around, making sure no one important saw him slip away. I didn't move from the ridge. I didn't need to. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. A single text from an unknown number. "They're hiding something. Meet me." I didn't have to guess who sent it. Jake was the only one left inside the HOA machine who still had a conscience, and enough technical knowledge to know when something was very, very wrong. I started down the ridge path again, boots skidding on loose gravel. The last hour of daylight stretched long and gold across the water, painting the glass pods in colors far too pretty for what they truly were. When I reached the bottom of the trail, Jake was already waiting beside the old pilings, helmet in hand, eyes darting around like he was afraid the waves themselves might be listening. "Remy," he said, voice low. "We need to talk." "I figured," I answered. He exhaled hard, the kind of breath a man releases when he's been holding something in too long. "They're building fast because they're hiding things." My jaw tightened. "What things?" "Everything," he said. "Permits, stability reports, environmental reviews. None of it exists. Every time I asked, Bethany said legal had it covered. But when I checked, there's no record. Not at the state, not federally, not anywhere." He rubbed the back of his neck, shame flickering across his face. "I should have walked away sooner. But they paid well. And she's convincing. Makes you feel like you're standing in the way of progress if you ask too many questions. And now? Now the whole place is at risk. Structural, legal, all of it. And if someone doesn't stop her, it won't just be investors who lose money. People could lose everything they've built their lives on." I looked out over the shimmering water. People had already lost things. Homes, peace, a wife. I turned back to Jake. "She never asked the most important question." He frowned. "What's that?" I tapped my boot lightly against the rocky shore. "Who owns the ground under her empire?" The last rays of sunlight bled into the horizon as the floating villas glowed like lanterns preparing to burn out. Jake followed my gaze, realization dawning slow and heavy across his features. "You knew," he whispered. "All along." "I learned from the best," I said. "My father taught me the importance of watching before you act." "And now?" Now the wind shifted, cool, deliberate, carrying the faint metallic scent of a storm still days away. "Now," I said, "the watching is almost done." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The bay stretched wide and glimmering before us, peaceful on the surface, hiding layers of history beneath. A lone gull drifted overhead, its call echoing across the water. Jake shoved both hands into his pockets, the weight of what he'd just learned settling over him like a wet coat. "Remy," he finally said, "you mind telling me exactly what you have? Because whatever it is, it scared the hell out of her this morning." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I crouched near one of the old pilings, running my fingertips along the cracked wood. My father carved a date into that post, 1974. The year he bought this land. The year he told me, at 6 years old, that some things in life were worth protecting before you even knew their purpose. I stood, brushing dirt from my hands. "You want to see the whole truth?" I asked. Jake nodded. "Come with me." We walked along the shoreline, our boots crunching over gravel and shells. Waves lapped softly against the rocks, each one pulling back with a faint sucking sound. The horizon was turning rose-colored now, the last of the evening light stretching long across the sand. Halfway up the ridge, Jake stopped to catch his breath. "I forgot how steep this trail is," he muttered, squinting toward the cliffs. "My father never believed in shortcuts," I said. "Figured if something was worth getting to, it was worth sweating for." We reached the top as the sun dipped low, lighting the ranch in warm gold. The house stood quiet, solemn, as if aware of the history it held. The old cedar boards gave off that faint, comforting scent that always reminded me of summers spent fixing fences with Dad. I led Jake through the house and down the narrow hallway to the storage room. The air inside was still and cool. Dust motes floated lazily in the shaft of light coming from the small window. Boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, each one labeled in my father's handwriting. Maps, surveys, deeds, logs. I knelt beside the oldest box and lifted the lid. "These," I said, "are the coordinates I mentioned. Every depth chart, every survey, every boundary line my father mapped from the 1960s through the early 2000s. Jake stared down at the pages, the edges yellowed with age. He picked one up carefully, eyes narrowing as he read. This is the bay's geological structure, he murmured. These charts, Remy, these are accurate to within a meter. How did he get this level of detail? This is federal quality surveying. He used to contract for them, I said. Water systems, dam inspections, coastal mapping. He did private work too. When the old maritime company went bankrupt, he bought the submerged land rights. Cheap. No one thought the bay was worth anything back then. Jake's eyes widened. Wait, submerged land rights? You mean… Yeah, I said quietly. I own the bottom of that bay. He blinked. The entire thing? Every square foot. Silence pooled between us, thick and heavy. Jake set the survey back into the box with trembling hands. Remy, if that's true, then everything they're building, every villa, every walkway, every piling, is sitting on land they don't have permission to use, I said, or anchor to, or profit from. He swallowed hard. And they never checked, he whispered. No, I said. They assumed no one would question them, and they assumed the man on the ridge was too quiet to fight back. Jake let out a breath that seemed to deflate him. He sank onto an old wooden stool. Remy, this is massive. If you bring this forward… I'm not bringing anything forward, I said. Not yet. His brows pulled together. Why not? I closed the lid on the box, dust rising like a soft cloud. For a moment, I ran my hand across the wood, feeling the grooves my father carved decades ago. Because timing matters, I said. If I'd acted too early, they'd have patched the holes, filed late permits, paid off the right people, found a loophole or two. The courts might have forced them to compensate me, but that would have been the end of it. Jake nodded slowly, understanding creeping across his face. But now? He said. Now, I replied. They've built a $100 million monument to their arrogance, sold units they had no legal right to sell, collected HOA fees on a bay they don't own, violated every approval process they claimed to follow. Jake let out a long, low whistle. You let them finish the whole thing, so the consequences would be complete. Exactly, I said. The law doesn't just slap wrists for this sort of thing. It reclaims, it restores, and it removes anything built illegally on private land. I stepped closer to the window. Outside, the floating villas shimmered in the fading light, bright jewels on borrowed water. My father used to say the bay keeps its own score, I murmured. Tides wash away lies. Waves reveal truth. And sooner or later, anything not anchored in what's real will fall. Jake stood beside me, shoulders tense but gaze steady. So what happens next? He asked. I watched the first stars appear above the horizon. Next, Vasant, I said. I stop watching. And I start acting. The next morning broke with the kind of sharp coastal wind that rattles porch rails and bends the cedar trees sideways. Clouds stacked low along the ridge, dragging their shadows across the ranch, as if they were trying to warn me. Storms don't roll in without stirring up what lies beneath. I stepped out onto the porch with a thermos of black coffee and listened. Down in the bay, engines were already humming. Construction crews were awake early, too early for a normal day. Then I saw why. A dozen HOA security boats formed a perimeter around the floating community, their blue lights flashing in slow intervals. On the central balcony, bright even in the gray morning light, stood Bethany Reed in another one of her tailored pink suits. She held a wireless microphone like it was a scepter. Even from a distance, I could feel the edge in her voice. "Residents!" she boomed, voice projected across the bay by the HOA's sound system. "We have an urgent situation." I let the porch screen door fall shut behind me. That tone, icy under honey, meant trouble. By the time I reached the bottom of the ridge and stepped onto the lower trail, her voice was rising. "This threat to our community has persisted long enough. We have photographic evidence of repeated unauthorized surveillance by an individual who does not respect our rules or our property." "My property," she said. The irony almost made me laugh. Residents gathered behind her, some clutching coffee mugs, some wrapped in fancy robes, all restless. Some glanced toward the ridge where they knew my ranch sat tucked in among the cedars. I reached the water's edge and stood still, listening. "This man," Bethany continued, flashing a blown-up photo of me paddling my aluminum skiff, "has approached restricted areas, filmed our platforms, and interfered with construction." Interfered. If collecting depth readings in my own bay counted as interference, then sure. "And now," she went on, "he is attempting to undermine the stability of our entire community through baseless claims." Baseless. That word hung in the air like a challenge. Jake appeared near the staircase leading to the lower deck. His helmet was off, tucked under his arm. He didn't look at me directly, but his shoulders stiffened when Bethany spoke his name. "A trusted engineer," she said, "informed us of this individual's presence in unauthorized locations. He has expressed concerns about safety." That stopped Jake cold. He looked up sharply, shocked, betrayed, furious. Bethany smiled, a thin, polished smile that said she wasn't above sacrificing anyone to protect herself. "And therefore," she said triumphantly, "we are calling for a vote tonight. A vote to enforce community protections, including legal action and a no-access perimeter. We will not be intimidated." I stepped onto my small dock. That's when the whispers began, residents murmuring, looking toward me, pointing. A few phones, lifted, capturing pictures they thought might become evidence later. My quiet bay had turned into an arena. Fine. If it was an arena Bethany wanted, I'd let her fill the seats before turning on the lights. I reached into my coat and pulled out the envelope Sarah Mitchell had insisted I start carrying. Sarah had been my attorney for years, smart, calm, and sharper than any blade in Bethany's filing cabinet. She'd helped me gather the right documents, the right statutes, the right language. She'd also told me this: "When she moves first, Remy, let her. A desperate person always reveals their weak spots." Below, the HOA security boats drifted toward my side of the bay, engines idling low like growls. Then from behind me, a truck door slammed. Sheriff Dunn walked down the short path to the dock, boots thudding on the weathered planks. He chewed thoughtfully on a toothpick, eyes scanning the bay before landing on me. "You planning to attend that meeting of theirs tonight?" he asked. "I reckon I am." "They're riled up," he warned. "They should be." He snorted. "Bethany sent an email saying you're a danger to the community." "I suppose she's right," I said, "just not in the way she thinks." He considered that, then gave a slow nod. "Well, I got a feeling she's about to walk herself into something she won't walk back out of." I watched the sun finally break through the clouds, sending a golden stripe across the water toward the floating villas. "She already has," I said. That evening, as dusk settled over the bay, the central balcony lit up like a stage. Dozens of residents filed into rows of polished wooden chairs. Camera drones hovered above, recording everything. Security guards lined the railings. And Bethany stood at the podium, chin lifted, every inch the self-appointed queen of a kingdom built on sand. "Before we vote," she announced, "we must address the man who has been causing disruption, distress, and danger to this community." She gestured dramatically toward the stairs. "Mr. Cole, if you insist on being present tonight, come forward so we may all hear what you think you know." A murmur rolled through the crowd. I stepped into the circle of light. Jake saw me first. He straightened, hope flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. Sarah was beside him, a thick folder under her arm. Sheriff Dunn stood just inside the entryway, hands clasped behind his back, watching everything with the stillness of a man who'd seen this sort of pride and fall before. Bethany's smile tightened. "Mr. Cole," she said sweetly, "do you have anything you'd like to say before we finalize our decision?" I stopped in front of the podium. "I do," I said. "Just one thing." Silence settled like a held breath. I reached into my coat and laid the document on the podium. The parchment's edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the state seal shone under the lights. "Before you vote," I said slowly, clearly, "you should see this." Bethany glanced at it and froze, her entire face drained of color. From the back of the balcony, a single resident asked, What is that?" I met Bethany's eyes. The truth. The word trembled through the air like the first crack in a dam. A few board members leaned forward to see the paper better, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization to fear. The tension in the balcony thickened until it felt like the whole place was holding its breath. I lifted the document, letting the lights catch the embossed seal. "This," I said, voice steady, "is the deed to the submerged land beneath this entire bay, signed by the state, registered, notarized, owned by my family since 1974. A ripple of disbelief surged across the crowd. Bethany tried to speak, choking on her words before she managed, "That's impossible. This bay is part of the Nautilus Point Development Project. We acquired all rights through the—" "No," I cut in quietly. "You didn't." I let the silence land before continuing. "You acquired surface use agreements for floating structures in a different cove. Then your developer shifted the project half a mile offshore, onto land no one thought to check. Onto land my father bought before most of you were born." Murmurs broke out behind me. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Is this real?" Jake stepped forward from the shadows of the balcony. His clipboard trembled in his hand. "It is," he said. "I verified the survey coordinates myself. Every piling, every anchor, every foundation point sits directly over coal-owned seabed." The crowd erupted, voices overlapping in panic and anger. "What does that mean for us? Does he own our homes? Did the HOA know?" Bethany slammed her hand onto the podium, trying to regain control. "This is nonsense," she shouted. "Even if that paper is authentic, which I doubt, the HOA obtained all necessary permits." Jake sucked in a breath, his temper finally cracking. "There are no permits, Bethany." Dozens of heads swiveled toward him. "No state construction permits," he continued, voice raised now. "No federal environmental clearance. No Army Corps' approvals. You lied to buyers, to investors, to everyone." Bethany's jaw locked. "You were fired for insubordination. You're bitter. This is retaliation." Jake shook his head. "I'm not bitter. I'm tired of watching you bury people in your mistakes." There was a long pause. Then a voice from the crowd, a trembling, furious man in a linen shirt, asked the question no one wanted answered. "If none of this is legal, what happens now?" He didn't direct the question at me. He didn't direct it at Bethany. He asked it into the air, as though the bay itself might answer. Instead, the answer came from the stairs. A woman's voice, precise, calm, authoritative. "That depends on how quickly this community cooperates." The entire balcony turned, and there, ascending step by step, were two agents from the State Water Authority. Their navy jackets bore the silver wave and anchor emblem. Behind them, Sheriff Dunn followed, hands folded, gaze steady. At their center was Sarah Mitchell, my attorney, carrying a thick case file under her arm. Bethany stumbled backward from the podium. "No," she whispered. "You can't be here. This is private property. This is a private meeting." One of the agents stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, "when structures illegally occupy state-recognized private land, when development proceeds without environmental review or permits, and when those structures endanger residents, any meeting related to that land becomes subject to state intervention." Residents shifted uneasily. Some rose from their chairs. Sarah approached the podium, opened her file, and laid out several documents. "Mrs. Reed," she said, "you've been notified, through certified mail, email, and courier delivery, of multiple violations over the last 18 months. Bethany's lips trembled. I never received anything." Sarah nodded, not unkindly. "Your legal team signed for all notices. Whether they shared them with you is another matter." A murmur swept the crowd like a wind through dry grass. One of the agents raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Effective immediately, Nautilus Point's development project is declared non-compliant with state and federal law. All operations must cease." Gasps, cries. A chair scraped loudly across the decking. Another agent unrolled a large printed order. "And due to the unlawful occupation of privately owned submerged land," he continued, "the entire structure is subject to removal." Bethany staggered as though someone had struck her. "Remove? You can't remove homes. Families live here. People paid for—" "They paid for something," I said softly. "Just not what you told them." A woman in the crowd began crying. A man cursed under his breath. Someone else asked whether their mortgages were affected. The panic was spreading fast now, like cracks racing through glass. Bethany lunged toward me. "You did this!" she screamed. "You and your dusty ranch and your outdated paperwork. You're destroying a community." I didn't flinch. "No," I replied. "The truth is, and the truth was here long before you were." She opened her mouth again, but a hand gently touched her arm. It was the agent. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "please step aside. This order is final." Bethany looked around wildly, hoping someone, anyone, would defend her. But all she saw were faces filled with shock, betrayal, and rising anger. The pedestal she'd built for herself had cracked beneath her feet, and it was only the beginning. As the agents began distributing notices to the board members, someone in the back asked the question everyone else was afraid to say aloud. "What happens next?" The agent answered without hesitation. "This entire development," he said, "is illegal." A sound rose from the crowd. Not a scream or a gasp, but a unified, unsettled groan, like an old ship straining against a storm. People shifted uneasily in their seats, clutching the papers that were now being handed to them. White sheets with bold black letters. Notice of violation, notice of removal. Mandatory evacuation. Timeline, 90 days. 90 days. 90 days to dismantle the floating paradise that had taken them 5 years and millions of dollars to build. The wind swept across the balcony, rustling the notices like brittle leaves. The bay below grew darker as storm clouds massed at the horizon, dyeing the water a bruised gray. I stepped back, giving residents space to absorb what was happening. Rage simmered in some of their stares. Others looked terrified. A few simply looked tired. Tired of being lied to. Tired of being manipulated. Tired of believing in a dream that had never been real. That's when the shouting started. "You said everything was legal. My unit cost $2.8 million. You told us you had every permit. Bethany, how could you hide this?" She absorbed each accusation like a blow, staggering backward until her heels hit the podium. Her face twisted between denial and desperation. "This can't be right," she snapped. "Someone made a mistake. Someone—" She swung toward me. "You did this. You're destroying our homes." "No," I said. "I'm ending an illegal occupation of my land." Her mouth opened again, rage boiling over, but Sarah stepped between us. "Mrs. Reed," she said calmly, "the issue isn't Mr. Cole. It's your HOA's failure to secure legal authorization before building an entire city on privately owned seabed." Sarah lifted a second document, this one stamped by the court. "And a judge agrees." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled across the balcony. Behind Bethany, board members shrank away from her. A few slipped off their HOA badges. The investors who'd stood proudly by her side mere weeks ago now refused to meet her eyes. The wind picked up again, carrying the metallic tang of the coming storm. The floating pods shivered as the waves under them grew choppier. It was as if the water beneath them finally understood it would soon be free again. A man from the front row stepped forward, holding his notice in a trembling hand. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked. "Move? Pack up everything? Where are we supposed to go?" His voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw not a wealthy buyer, not an HOA supporter, but a man who'd been deceived by someone he trusted. Sarah answered gently. "There will be restitution hearings, fraud investigations, but right now the priority is safety. None of these structures were built with proper clearance. They pose real risks." Jake nodded beside her. "One heavy storm, one rogue wave, and entire sections could fail. I've warned her about this for years." Bethany's eyes snapped toward him. "You traitor. After everything I—" But Jake didn't let her finish. "I'm not betraying you," he said, voice quiet but firm. "I'm saving the people you endangered." The remark landed hard. More residents stepped forward now, shouting questions, accusations, demands. The HOA security guards couldn't calm them. Even the agents had to raise their voices to restore some order. That's when the final blow arrived. Agent Morris lifted a megaphone. "Attention all residents," he announced. "Due to structural and legal hazards, the State Water Authority will begin supervised deconstruction procedures immediately. You are granted 90 days to vacate the premises." A man shouted, "You can't tear down my home!" A woman sobbed, clutching her little dog. Another resident threw their HOA badge onto the floor. Bethany simply stared, hollow-eyed, as her kingdom unraveled. "You're destroying my life," she whispered toward me, barely audible over the rising wind. I turned to her, meeting her tear-streaked gaze. "No," I said. "Your lie destroyed itself. I'm just standing here when it finally came apart." A loud crack rang out as the first storm gust hit the floating platforms. The balcony shuddered beneath our feet. The glass railing flexed with a groan. The agents began ushering people toward the interior hall for safety. I stood where I was, watching the bay churn and swell, watching the glass pods rock uneasily, like fragile lanterns on a restless sea, watching the empire of Nautilus Point bow under the weight of truth. And then, quietly, almost reverently, I whispered to myself, "And yet, the hardest day hasn't arrived." Because Demolition Day was coming, and on that day, the bay would take back everything that had been stolen from it. 3 days later, just after dawn, the bulldozers arrived. 3 massive yellow machines resting on floating steel platforms that looked too heavy to belong on water. Their engines rumbled like a distant storm waking up. The sky was streaked with pale gray clouds, the kind that never fully commit to rain but hover with a quiet promise of reckoning. Residents gathered along the balconies, hundreds of them, clutching jackets against the sharp wind. Some looked furious. Some looked grief-stricken. Most looked stunned, as though reality had slipped out from under their feet. And in a way, it had. The first order of the day was evacuation. State agents moved from villa to villa, knocking gently, patiently explaining what must happen. Some residents complied silently, dragging suitcases across swaying walkways. Others stood frozen, staring at the homes they had poured their savings into. I watched them with a complicated ache in my chest. None of these people deserved the lies they were sold. Most had gotten caught in Bethany's orbit and never realized how little ground they actually stood on. A horn blasted across the bay. The lead bulldozer operator raised his hand to signal readiness. And that was the moment Bethany Reed appeared. She stumbled onto the central dock, hair whipped by the wind, wearing the same hot pink suit she'd worn at the emergency meeting, as if refusing to accept that anything had changed. Mascara streaked her cheeks. Her heels clicked sharply on the platform until the walkway trembled beneath her weight. "Stop!" she shrieked, throwing her hand into the air. "You can't do this! I built this community! I brought people together! You can't tear down their homes!" One of the state officials approached gently. "Mrs. Reed, the order is final. The court? I don't care about the court," she cried. "This is my bay." A gust of wind stole her last word, casting it uselessly across the water. I stepped forward then, boots thudding softly on the wooden dock. The boards flexed under my weight. A quiet reminder that everything built on water was meant to move, shift, drift, not stand in defiance of truth. Bethany saw me and pointed with a trembling hand. "You!" she spat. "You did this to me. You destroyed everything." I stopped a few feet from her. The wind tugged at my coat, carrying the heavy smell of diesel and salt. "No," I said quietly. "Everything here was destroyed the moment it was built on land that didn't belong to you." The bulldozer engines revved behind us, low and resonant. The sound rippled across the bay like a warning drum. Her lips quivered. "You could have stopped this." "I tried," I said. "For 5 years I tried to keep to myself. You're the one who pushed into my water, fined me on my own dock, and dragged this bay into your fantasy. I just let the truth rise to the surface." Her knees buckled, and for a second I thought she might fall. A resident caught her elbow, not out of affection, but reflex. She shook the hand away and stood alone. Up on the ridge behind me, storm clouds rolled in, darkening the edges of the sky. The wind stiffened. Waves slapped against the pilings. The bay felt restless. Ready. A voice crackled through a loudspeaker. "Begin demolition." The lead bulldozer moved first, treads grinding against the metal platform. Its blade lowered and bit into the outer ring of a glass pod villa. The structure splintered with a sharp crack, shards falling like glittering rain onto the water below. A collective gasp rose from the balconies. Some residents turned away. Others watched with a kind of grim fascination, as though seeing the truth physically tear apart the illusion they had lived in. A crane swung overhead, its cable lowering to grip the dome of another villa. The machine strained, the steel groaning under the weight. Then, with a slow rip of metal, the dome separated from its frame. The floating platform tilted, water rushing over one edge as workers steadied it. The sound echoed like a crown being torn from a fallen ruler. Bethany covered her face. "My paradise," she whispered. "My home." I let the silence sit between us before answering. "You didn't build a home," I said. "You built a lie. Homes require foundations, and you never had one." Behind her, Jake stood among the inspectors, arms crossed, expression heavy with both sadness and relief. Sarah reviewed paperwork with a federal liaison. Sheriff Dunn watched from the shoreline, hat pulled low against the wind. All of them waiting for the bay to finish what the law had started. Another villa came apart, panels collapsing into a heap that workers guided onto barges. The walkways connecting the rings sagged without their original tension, dipping closer to the water with every removal. A woman cried, "What about restitution? What happens to us now?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm despite the storm building. "A federal judge has dissolved the HOA," she announced. "Every resident will be part of a restitution hearing. You were victims of fraudulent development and illegal sales. The courts will ensure compensation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not relief, not joy, but the first hint of something like hope. Then Sarah added the final blow. And Mrs. Reed, along with the development board, has been barred from serving on any HOA or community leadership organization for life. Bethany staggered as though struck. Her empire had not only fallen, it had been erased. As the bulldozers continued their slow, merciless work, I walked to the edge of the dock and looked out over the dismantling kingdom. Glass shards sparkled on the water. Metal groaned. Waves swallowed debris with hungry splashes. The bay was reclaiming itself. A resident approached me cautiously. "So, what will you do with it? All this? The bay?" I didn't answer yet, because even I didn't know. All I knew was this. Whatever came next would be built on truth. Not arrogance, not greed, not illusions. Truth. And for the first time since the day the barges arrived, the bay felt honest again. Months passed, and the floating empire of Nautilus Point disappeared piece by piece. First the glass pods, lifted onto barges like broken ornaments ready for disposal. Then the metal walkways, unbolted and folded like failed blueprints. The cranes left last, their silhouettes shrinking into the horizon until nothing remained except open, untouched water. Where futuristic villas once shimmered under the sun, only rippling reflections danced now. Some mornings the surface was so still it looked like polished slate. Other days it glittered with early light, lively and wild again, the way I remembered it as a child. The bay was breathing freely, and so was I. I rebuilt the old wooden dock myself, board by board. Not fancy, not symmetrical, just sturdy enough to hold a chair, a fishing rod, and the weight of quiet reflection. The cedar posts still smelled the same, earthy, resinous, familiar. When the breeze blew across the water, it carried hints of salt and memory. Sarah visited sometimes, usually carrying folders full of updates from the restitution cases. "It's not perfect," she'd say, setting paperwork beside my coffee mug. "But the courts are doing their best." She explained how former residents were being reimbursed, how investors were negotiating settlements, and how the federal fraud charges had stuck harder than any of us predicted. "Bethany got 12 years, she told me once, her voice quiet but steady. "Her developer partners got less, but none of them are walking free for a long time." I nodded, watching a gull glide low across the water. Justice rarely arrives loud. Sometimes it comes in the form of a judge reading sentences into a quiet courtroom. Sometimes in the form of time. Slow, measured, unavoidable. And sometimes in the form of a bay finally restored to what it should have been. Jake stopped by often too, carrying new engineering reports under his arm. He'd gotten a position with a coastal restoration program, helping rebuild wetlands and reinforce riverbanks after storms. "I figured," he told me one afternoon as he leaned on one of the dock posts, "it's time I put my skills to work fixing things instead of helping folks cut corners." I clapped him on the shoulder. "You're doing good work, Jake." He nodded toward the open water. "You ever think about developing it properly? You've got prime land rights. Someone might pay a fortune for this zone." I shook my head. "This place has had enough ambition thrown at it. It doesn't need more glass and steel." Jake smiled. "Didn't think you'd say anything else." Sometimes Marcus rode by on his fishing boat, tipping his hat in respect. Other times Sheriff Dunn drove up to the ridge to check the property line just for conversation's sake, leaning against his cruiser while telling stories from the courthouse or fishing for advice on repairing his fence. The bay had become something different now. Not a battleground, not a luxury commodity, just quiet. And that quiet meant more to me than any offer a developer could make. One evening, near sunset, I sat on the end of the dock with my father's old notebook open beside me. The same one that held the coordinates, the surveys, the proof that had toppled Nautilus Point's empire. I flipped to the back page. There, written in my father's careful handwriting, was a note he left after finishing his final survey. Land is a kind of promise. Water, too. They remember who respects them and who doesn't. I traced the words with my thumb, feeling the grooves of the ink stamped lightly into the page. The bay shimmered before me, a wash of orange and gold. A single pelican drifted across the surface, unbothered, unhurried, the master of a kingdom that had once been cluttered with noise and greed. Not anymore. A soft breeze lifted, rustling the pages of the notebook. I closed it gently and set it beside the lantern at my feet. Some victories are loud, crashing metal, falling glass, a bulldozer's roar echoing across the water. Others are quiet, felt in the steady rhythm of waves, in a dock that creaks at dusk, in the soft satisfaction of knowing the land is finally at peace. For me, this victory was quiet, and as darkness settled over the bay, the water glowed faintly under the rising moon. My father's dock, rebuilt with my own hands, stood firm against the tide. Zone 47B belonged to the Coles again, not as an empire, not as a spectacle, just as a place where truth finally came home to rest. If this story hit home for you, drop a simple justice in the comments. It lets me know you're out there standing your ground too. Out here, we learn that patience, truth, and a little grit can still beat the biggest bullies. And if you'd like more real stories of land, dignity, and the fight for what's yours, feel free to stick around and subscribe. I'd be glad to have you with me for the next one.